Sega, shorthand for service games, was an anomaly of a company in that it was Japanese yet American founded. The company had its roots in coin-operated gaming and eventually arcade games. With the rise in console gaming, Sega decided to take on Nintendo with a technically superior machine, the Sega Mark III, or Sega Master System. With the Second World War looming ahead, three American entrepreneurs, Irving Bromberg, his son, Martin Bromberg, who would later rename himself Martin Bromley, and James Humpert saw a business opportunity around 1940. Irving Bromberg was the owner of a coin-operated distribution company called Irving Bromberg Company. His son, Martin Bromberg, worked for his father once he finished high school. They thought with military traveling to various bases, the station's soldiers would need something to do in their spare time, and hence, Standard Games was founded. This company would distribute slot machines and other coin-operated machines to military bases. In February 1945, Standard Games was sold, and the three formed a company they would dub Service Games, or Sega for short. They continued to distribute machines as they had before. However, around 1951, the United States started to pass strict rules on slot machines, pinball, and other coin-operated electronics associated with gambling with the Transportation of Gambling Devices Act of 1951. The team saw another opportunity, and Richard Stuart was sent to Japan to distribute coin-operated machines there. Their business consisted of buying confiscated slot machines from the government and setting up game rooms in Japan for the servicemen stationed there. Marty partnered the business with the Japanese company Nihon Goraku, a large vending machine company that had started in 1951 to also take advantage of the American forces stationed in Japan. Service Games eventually branched into selling jukeboxes and opened their own manufacturing plant, and by 1960, they were one of Japan's three largest coin-operated entertainment companies, these three being Service Games, now going by Sega, Taito, and Rosen Enterprises Limited. Rosen Enterprises Limited was established by David Rosen. Rosen began his business in the early 1950s by bringing American-style photo booths to Japan, where the Japanese were in need of ID photos. At that point in time, the people in Japan had a great need for ID photos. You virtually needed an ID photo for school applications, for rice ration cards, for railway cards, and for employment, obviously. At the time, all the Japanese had were photographers whose photos would take 2 to 3 days to develop, so Rosen's Nifun Shashin, or 2-minute photo, was an immediate success. Photorama became so successful that it enabled me over a short period of time to open well over 100 such locations throughout Japan. He drew upon this success to import American pinball and coin-operated games to Japan, which he would set up around his photo booths. These also proved incredibly lucrative. He wanted to expand this to local businesses, but was blocked by the Japanese government, where he would need a license from the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. Fighting for over a year, he finally secured the license and was able to successfully expand. However, more and more competitors were rising. In 1964, the Big Three, Taito, Service Games, and Rosen Enterprises Limited, decided to discuss merging their business. Taito dropped out. However, Rosen Enterprises Limited and Service Games merged forces. David Rosen became the president and CEO of Sega, which was the larger of the two companies. The company name was officially changed to Sega Enterprises Limited. By 1966, Rosen had decided that the current coin-operated games had become stagnant and had Sega manufacture its first game, Periscope. Periscope was expensive to make, but it ended up being such a major success that distributors from America and Europe wanted to import it. Complaining that it cost too much to purchase, David Rosen suggested that the price should be 25 cents per play instead of the previous standard of 10 cents. Distributors listened, and this became the new arcade standard, with this being the very first arcade game to cost 25 cents per play. In 1967, the four owners of the merged company, including David Rosen and Marty Bromley, sold the company to Gulf and Western for a large sum of money, with the stipulation being that David Rosen had to remain CEO and chairman through 1972. In 1974, Charlie Bludorn, the chairman of Gulf and Western, made Sega a US-listed company so David Rosen could grow it. Sega went ahead and bought Gremlin, a US video game company who would help develop arcade games for Sega. Sega eventually began developing successful original titles such as Astro Blaster in 1981 and Zaxxon in 1982, as well as distributing successful games such as Konami's Frogger in 1981. Meanwhile, in 1979, David Rosen bought a Japanese distribution company which had been founded by a Japanese man named Hayao Nakayama. But while fortunes continued to escalate, the video game crash of the 1980s was looming. While profits kept rising in the 1980 to 1982 periods, I became very concerned regarding the economics of the industry. I felt that sound fiscal principles were being ignored and that the wild expansion would lead to a very serious bust. Rosen was correct, and by 1983, disaster struck the industry with the infamous video game crash in the United States. Gulf and Western sold Sega's US assets to Bally/Midway, and David Rosen was given the offer to buy back the Japanese portion for $38 million. He agreed to this, with none other than Hayao Nakayama and a few other investors also contributing, taking control of Sega Japan in March 1984. Hayao Nakayama was then made president of Sega Japan and would eventually become the CEO. Around this time, Nakayama wanted to start creating home consoles. An engineer named Hideki Sato and his team were put to the task, and Sega began work on the SG-1000 and SC-3000. In order to expand the business rapidly, the company put out the SG-1000 cartridge-based game console simultaneously with the SC-3000, which was a cartridge-based computer like the MSX. Sega also released a selection of handheld LCD games similar to Game & Watch. The SG-1000 featured a similar infrastructure to the 1982 ColecoVision and was released to Japan in 1983, the same month as the Nintendo Famicom, which was a console vastly technically superior. We learned that Nintendo planned to release their own console system at the same time, so we removed the keyboard from the SC-3000 and marketed it as a new home console, the SG-1000. The SG-1000 was crushed. A second version was released a year later in 1984 with an updated controller to match the now popularized control pad Nintendo had standardized, but to no avail. And yet, despite this, according to Hideki Sato, spirits at Sega were high. No one predicted how big of a hit the SG-1000 would be. The first year alone, we sold 160,000 units. They sold so well, we started to get stars in our eyes, thinking we might sell 500,000. It was a scale completely incomparable with our arcade board sales, and that is how our entire company caught console fever and threw ourselves into that side of game development. For comparison, Hideki Sato also stated that, in the beginning we were shocked at the difference in sales volume between arcade and consumer markets. Back then, an arcade machine of ours would only sell about 5,000 units, so even a small change in production costs could yield a good profit. Notably, one of the games on the SG-1000 was the 1984 release of Girl's Garden. This game features a girl who must collect flowers for her boyfriend in a field filled with bears. This game was the very first game directed by Yuji Naka, who would later go on to be a major force behind Sonic the Hedgehog. Not only this, but Yu Suzuki, who would become Sega's most prolific arcade game designer and went on to create both Virtua Fighter and Shenmue, created his first game for the SG-1000, Champion Boxing. My first project, Champion Boxing, was also my first time as project leader, so I learned a lot about working in a team and managing people, as well as programming sounds and graphics. The SC-3000 was more successful as a low-price entry-level computer, but never truly took off, with strong competition stemming from other more established computers. It was never released worldwide, and only saw a release in Japan and certain PAL regions. With the failure of both the SG-1000 and SG-1002, Sega decided to make a console that would be more powerful than the Famicom in order to compete. Once again, using Hideki Sato and the same engineers who had worked on the SG-1000, as well as Masami Ishikawa, who was the team leader on design, Sega released its newest console, the Sega Mark III, to Japan in October 1985. The Sega Mark III featured both a cartridge slot and the ability to take lower quality, but cheaper game cards. Not only this, but it was backwards compatible with all of the SG-1000 games. The Mark III could display double the number of sprites of the SG-1000, from 32 to 64, and featured a vastly improved sound chip. However, despite being technically more powerful than the competing Nintendo Famicom, Nintendo's now 2-year head start was too much, and strict third-party licensing techniques made it difficult for the Sega Mark III to compete. Fortunately for Sega, a new star was rising amongst their staff, Yu Suzuki. After creating Champion Boxing, Sega was so impressed, Yu Suzuki was promoted as a project leader where he began working on arcade games for the company. The first of these was Hang On, a motorcycle arcade game that would be the first of its kind released in 1985. The game was revolutionary in that instead of using a traditional controller, players would be able to sit on a motorcycle and would turn by shifting their body weight on the fake motorcycle. This proved to be only the first of a string of arcade hits, with Yu Suzuki's very next game also released in 1985. The arcade cabinet was proposed to be so expensive that Sega's heads were hesitant to build it. Yu Suzuki told them if the game failed, he would forfeit his salary. The game was Space Harrier, and went on to become another arcade classic and a major success for Sega. These games were then ported to the Sega Mark III as exclusives. While they were nowhere near as technically powerful as their arcade counterparts, nor did they feature the specialized arcade controls, they did at least give the Mark III some strong exclusive titles. Attempting to gain a foothold in America, Sega rebranded the console the Sega Master System and released it to the States in 1986, retailing at $200. Included in this was a multi-cart featuring Safari Hunt and Yu Suzuki's Hang On, as well as a light gun modeled after the Zillion gun from the Zillion anime. Without a strong American distribution chain, Sega contracted the American toy company Tonka to distribute the Master System in the United States. This seemed like a perfect fit as Tonka already had an established toy distribution network, and Sega followed up by investing in advertising.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
But Nintendo would release their American equivalent of the Famicom to the States in 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Master System once again failed to compete. While it sold better than the Atari 7800, which was also released to the States in 1986, the Master System only sold 125,000 units in comparison to the NES selling over 1 million units the same year. And by 1987, once again, just like in Japan, the Sega Master System was completely crushed by the NES, thanks in part to Nintendo's extremely strict third-party licensing terms. We did not have killer games. Activision and Parker Brothers were our only third-party developers. Also, we were not familiar with the consumer business or the distribution and marketing of consumer products, unlike Nintendo. 1987 also saw the Mark III re-release as the Sega Master System in Japan. However, this was also unsuccessful. The Sega Master System did fare better in Europe in spite of a rocky start. Here, Sega was unable to meet the demand of multiple distributors, causing the distributors Mastertronic and Master Games to enter financial crisis, while the third distributor, Ariolasoft, vowed to never work with Sega again. Despite this start, advance orders were high for the Sega Master System, and it ended up being a successful system, in part thanks to Nintendo not having as strong of a European foothold. One of the Master System's most popular franchises, Wonder Boy, also spawned in 1987. Wonder Boy was a direct port of the 1986 arcade game of the same name and featured a boy named Boy, or Tom Tom depending on the port. Players controlled Tom Tom as he attempted to platform to the end of a level under a time limit. Collecting fruit would extend this time limit. I think what motivated me was Super Mario Bros. For the Famicom. The game had a very bad control system. To put it simply, the game was frustrating. I wondered why it wasn't more exhilarating, and that spurred me on to make Wonder Boy. While the game was also ported to the SG-1000 in 1986, its Master System port was a more faithful adaptation, with its RPG-esque sequel, Wonder Boy Monsterland, also ported to the Master System. Series spin-off Monster World 2: The Dragon's Trap was created specifically for the Master System and Game Gear, featured a Metroidvania-style level design, and is creator Ryuichi Nishizawa's personal favorite of the series. Interestingly, while Sega was the publisher of these titles, the developer was able to get their games ported to other systems by Hudson Soft. Nintendo's strict exclusivity clause meant that Hudson Soft would have to completely rework the game if they wanted an NES release, which led them to creating a modified version of Wonder Boy titled Adventure Island. Adventure Island went on to become a successful Nintendo franchise. Also meant to compete with Super Mario Bros., and the game that would eventually come to most strongly represent the Sega Master System was Alex Kidd, created by Kotaro Hayashida. Sega had just put out the new Sega Mark III, and they tasked us in the second development unit to create something that would sell as well as Mario, and so we set out to develop a new action game. Alex Kidd focused on Alex, who would platform throughout the stages with his main ability to punch enemies in obstacles for both power-ups and money he could use to purchase further power-ups. In an effort to distinguish the game from Mario, the team went about making minute changes, which led to a few bizarre decisions, as admitted by Kotaro Hayashida himself. We reversed the jump and attack buttons from Mario. At the time, we thought we were doing something different, but we were mistaken. Now when I look back on it, it's just nonsense, and it's harder to play that way. This even led to the boss encounters, which instead of playing like the rest of the game, involved a rock, paper, scissors match with the boss. That was also one of our concepts to differentiate our game from Mario. It's a very fanciful, absurd idea. Definitely for people who are good at action games, to lose everything in game over because of a rock, paper, scissors match, yeah, that sucks. The staff at Sega shared these concerns, but I wanted to know how players would react to it, so I left it in. While Alex Kidd was initially sold as a cartridge title like other games, it was eventually built into editions of the Master System and went on to spawn multiple sequels. What would end up being the longest lasting series coming from the Sega Master System was the JRPG Phantasy Star. Phantasy Star was designed by Kotaro Hayashida and Miki Morimoto, and notably, Yuji Naka, programmer of Sonic the Hedgehog, served as programmer of the game. Phantasy Star released to Japan in December 1987, the same month as Final Fantasy, and a year after Dragon Quest created the JRPG genre. Our goal was to create a full-scale Sega RPG. The biggest influence was the home computer game Dragon Quest. As Phantasy Star was on the more powerful Sega Master System, the team was able to animate the enemies, which would become a JRPG staple. They also decided to flesh out their characters, something that hadn't been done yet in other JRPGs, as until then, characters were a blank slate for the player. Phantasy Star became a successful franchise with its Sega Genesis sequel, Phantasy Star 2, receiving high acclaim. Multiple sequels released throughout the Genesis era, and a spin-off MMORPG, Phantasy Star Online, was eventually developed. In 1989, the Sega Master System was released to Brazil and distributed through Tectoy. The console was such a huge success in Brazil that Tectoy ended up converting newer games for the Brazilian Master System, such as Game Gear's Sonic Blast and Capcom's Street Fighter II. Despite its success in Europe and Brazil, the Sega Master System was never able to come close to competing with the giant that was Nintendo in both the Japanese and American markets. However, Hayao Nakayama and Hideki Sato were busy at work on a follow-up to the Master System, a console that would challenge Nintendo's reign as a new era of video games was beginning. If you enjoyed this video, check out my other videos in this series, such as the history of Nintendo and the NES, or one of my comedic super shows. As always, all of the sources are listed in the description, and I recommend checking them out. Thanks for watching. Peace.